All right, so let's get into some of the history of our friend James Taylor here. So this week I read a book called Long Ago and Far Away, James Taylor, His Life and Music by Timothy White. Now, we don't have enough time in an entire episode to talk about the history of James Taylor's family. In fact, I'm very surprised he was never featured on that PBS show, Finding Your Roots. And if you're not familiar with that show, it's this professor named Henry Louis Gates. He gets celebrities and then they spend a bunch of money and on genealogists and going into the microfiche and they tell celebrities about their families 100, 200, 300 years ago. And that would be accurate for James Taylor. The author of the book was able to trace his roots back to Scotland in 1601, where his family were prominent shipbuilders, traders, seafarers. And in the mid 1700s, his ancestors opened up shipping offices in Jamaica and Portugal, had thousands of acres of farmland in Scotland. So there was a lot of money from very early on in his family's life.
Country road.
So is that why he does a fake Jamaican accent on his reggae album from the 80s?
Oh, God. Is that where that song Mexico is from?
No,
I'm
just kidding. I hope that doesn't happen.
And that's how you can tell where my research ended. I didn't go through his entire discography. So the Taylors, that family, would land in the USA in North Carolina in 1790. In 1790, where they quickly built a mansion. And then jumping forward about 60 years, the family had 14 properties in North Carolina. They owned a plantation in Mississippi with 75 slaves. So they were doing okay financially, not necessarily morally. That's probably not a good move, but whatever. Bill Maher talked about the presentism thing, right? You got to understand the times.
I mean, it's not James Taylor's fault directly. We could at least say that, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. The whole sins of the father thing. I don't buy into
that.
So he's got a real list of characters in his family history, including a spy for the Confederacy. That spy was a woman, and her husband served as a character witness in the murder trial of an ex-soldier named Tom Dula, whose hanging in 1868 would inspire the North Carolina folk song Tom Dooley. You ever heard this?
I think I've heard it.
You probably heard it. Did
I? Yeah.
Think banjo 1800s. Okay. I was going to play it.
Is that a segue to Oh Susanna? Is that an Oh Susanna segue?
That's the B side of Oh Susanna, actually.
My 1860s record collection is just too vast to go through that quickly.
Hang on, I'm going to turn off this original sound thing and see if I can do this.
Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Hang down your head and cry.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah, sure. So that song was that version of it was done by the Kingston Trio.
Oh,
yeah,
that was getting played in my household. My mom was a big Kingston Trio fan.
Oh, no way! That's probably where you know it from. Then.
Yeah, right. I think so.
That is Tom Dooley's a jam. So the one thing you can't say about his ancestry is that they were poor. All that land, success, wealth definitely worked its way through the centuries. Now, we could fill an entire book with the maritime exploits of his family, but we're going to jump forward into the 20th century.
Hold on. Somebody out there, please go write that book, The Maritime Exploits of James Taylor's Family.
We'll happily pump that book for many episodes. Many episodes in a row.
Please take creative liberties with the facts.
A giant wooden ship shaped as a guitar, potentially. So for the purposes of today, our story is going to start with James's parents, who would be Ike Taylor and Gertrude Trudy Woodard. So his parents were born in the early 1920s, his father in North Carolina, his mother in Massachusetts. His father obviously continued in the line of the very wealthy and successful Taylor family. He attended an exclusive prep school, received a bunch of honors as an undergraduate at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, then went on to Harvard Medical School and earned his doctorate, graduating with honors as a medical doctor. So regardless of how set up he was, though, this dude is a smart dude and he's a hard worker.
You know, he looks like a doctor later. You know, he's bald and he's got the little glasses.
Every man's doctor. You're right. That's a good call.
Combine that with the soothing voice, I'm in. I mean, bedside manner is important.
Did he make the right call going with James Taylor? Should have been Dr. James Taylor, James Taylor, MD.
Oh,
Was there an angle here he should have worked? I don't know. I don't know.
So his mother's side of the family also traced their roots back to the 1600s. And similarly, that side of the family was quite well off. She went to a finishing school, which, in addition to getting a basic education, women learned social graces, etiquette, everything you need to get by in high class and aristocratic circles. And she was also studying to be a soprano at the New England Conservatory of Music.
I would just like to say that there were a lot of things I could have said back there that would have been really funny, and I didn't say that.
Unload them. That's what editing is for, man.
No.
You don't want to be on the tape. All right, I got you.
The compromat file continues to grow.
So his mother, Trudy, knew at a young age what she wanted. And at 18 years old, her checklist for marriage was to gain wealth, to gain happiness, a companion, a fellow traveler, a nature lover, a Christian, a man who can ride horseback with me, play a short game of tennis with me, a man who will swim, dance, play, then work. Notice that she put work at the end of the list there. It's going to be a little hint of things to come. Well, she got at least some of those.
But you did like have her diary or something?
Yes. I think they went through some letters.
Yeah, okay.
This is just me taking liberties with what his mom would have said. Yeah, companion, tennis. What else do rich people do in the 50s? Well, she at least got some of those things when she met Ike at a med student party in 1944. She was drawn to him because he was talking about socialized medicine and his opposition to all the rampant segregation that was going on at the time in the South. So Ike got his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the couple got married in 1946. Shortly thereafter came the children. First was Alex, and then James Vernon Taylor on March 12th, 1948. That same year, his father Ike was appointed assistant medical advisor to Harvard University. So you can imagine Ike was not around a ton. A year later, in 1949, the Taylors welcomed another baby, this time a girl named Catherine. And a year after that, in 1950, another boy named Livingston. So they're now a family of 6. They have a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-year-old. A perfect time for Ike to accept a faculty position at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Damn.
Yeah.
Did we get any intel on why they named their last kid Livingston? That was a hard left turn in the naming department, right?
That's a good point. It was probably a side note somewhere in the book. I'm sure it referenced one of the 80 people in the family history back to the 1500s. So the family picks up and moves to the rural countryside in North Carolina near Chapel Hill. As you can imagine, Trudy picked up and moved from Boston. And with 4 children in tow, she was having a rough go of it, especially since Ike was rarely home. He was doing research, teaching, giving seminars. So Trudy was a definite fish out of water. And to stay sane, she often put on music for herself and the kids on the old phonograph, where they were exposed to what they called unfussy music, like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, basically American folk music. Now, needing some help with the kids and the house, they hire a woman named Effie, who was the wife of a sharecropper who worked the surrounding farms and who would stay their helpmate for close to 20 years. And James remembers his early childhood being very tranquil, rural, beautiful, but quiet. I mean, everything we're describing in his childhood, you can see coming out in his style, in the themes of his music, even on this album.
It's like the songs write themselves.
They really do. This shit writes itself. He said, I feel as though my experience coming of age, there was more a matter of landscape and climate than people, because there was just nobody around. And it's interesting to hear that because he did an interview with Oprah, and I think she called the Master Class, where he talked about how he writes music. And a lot of it is just him isolating himself, being forced to just exist in silence. And that is how his brain works. He says when he writes music or is preparing for an album, he'll just go isolate himself in a room for hours and for days.
Well, I'll tell you that the opposite certainly doesn't work. If you're just listening to podcasts and music all day, you're not going to write shit. I know from experience.
All right. I need to write a song. Let me turn on the radio. Rob, you're a little choppy. Hang on, I'm going to wait a second. All right, there you go. You're unbuffered. All right. And that might be me, but all right. Now, it's not long before the family moves again, but this is to a brand new house they'd built on 25 acres of land, still within Chapel Hill. Oh, and they had another kid named Hugh in 1952. So Ike, the father, is killing it. He's getting grants. He's doing research. He's getting newspaper articles written about him. Meanwhile, Trudy is getting involved in the anti-segregationist movement that's going on in the South. She's a black house helper, a black driver, and she does care for these people. But in North Carolina, it's blatant. You've got segregated schools, separate entries into retail stores, separate water fountains, super Jim Crow South at the time.
This is the mid-50s now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you may be asking yourself, when the two met, what did Ike do during World War II? Well, he got a deferment because he was in medical school.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah. Or was he rich is the other comment. But in 1955.
Had nothing to do with the shipping trade.
Right. The seafarers. But in 1955, his number comes up and his deferment comes up and he got called up by the military, which meant he had to go work for the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. However, not one to shy away from a challenge. He volunteered for a program called Operation Deep Freeze, which sounds like a sequel to an Incredibles movie, but it was in fact a military research mission in Antarctica.
What?
Sweet.
Ice Station Zebra?
Yeah,
absolutely. Everybody knows that's where the hole to Middle Earth is. Duh.
That's where all the good stuff is.
Everything. Yeah.
So he leaves his family for 2 years and 10 months to go live at the bottom of the world to study frostbite and help.
Hypothesis.
Yeah.
He doesn't like his family.
He thinks all of that was a big mistake. You know, we're going to see some evidence in that direction, Phil.
Okay, good.
Because going to Antarctica wasn't enough evidence.
Foreshadowing.
Sorry, honey, duty calls.
He just loved America that much. James recalls at one point in 1956, his mother getting the whole family, all the kids out onto the porch to take a photo because she was afraid that Ike, the father, had forgotten what the kids looked like. All right, so let's flash forward to 1957. Ike Taylor returns from Antarctica and is a functional alcoholic who had turned into a monstrous asshole, as you could imagine would happen being with a bunch of dudes in Antarctica for 3 years.
Has anyone ever gone to Antarctica and not become an alcoholic? Has that ever happened?
I think it's very unlikely.
I don't know.
Well, he was saying that as a medical doctor, he had access to, I don't know, isopropyl alcohol, or I think the government was giving people like one bottle or 1 6-pack a month or something to the boys, take care of the boys. And he was able to like smuggle booze in and out and stuff. So yeah, I think that fed into his addiction there. And he's a monstrous asshole, we mentioned. And it almost seemed as if he was doing everything he could to avoid his family, right? And as a 9-year-old, James understands the animosity growing between his parents. He can see this. And their relationship did cast a shadow over most of James's formative years, but it also informed a lot of the needful songwriting that was yet to come out of him.
Fire and rain.
So he said his father his father came home, but he never really returned. But amidst all of this misery, you've got a house full of burgeoning musicians. So more and more music was becoming one of the few stable parts, the stable routines of the Taylor household. So James took up the cello and took lessons on it for 4 years. In addition to instruments, it sounded like the whole house was full of songbirds. We heard that his mother was a singer. He and his siblings would sing folk hymns and radio jingles. And his mother really encouraged them to use their imaginations and be creative. She would, when they were all hanging out in the kitchen, she would just pick an object and tell the kids to write a jingle about it. And they would just have to, on the fly, come up with a melody and words. And so we kind of already see this songwriting, this singer mindset at a very young age in James. All right, so you always have these pivotal moments in these artists' lives, and one of those pivotal moments was for James at 12 years old. His mother, Trudy, takes him to New York City to see the musical Green Willow. And on the way home, he asks for a guitar for Christmas. All right, let's run our quick inventory here. Teenager, check. Guitar, check. Parents' marriage disintegrating, check. Absentee father, check. Miserable mother, check. We've got all of the ingredients for a bright future in entertainment. And as the children approached their teenage years and continued their schooling, no big surprise that the ever-missing Ike insisted that his kids go to private boarding schools. So James is sent to the Milton Academy in Massachusetts for high school. Now, keep in mind, his home is North Carolina. But before James heads off to Milton Academy, he gets to spend 3 months, basically his last summer of freedom, in Martha's Vineyard the year before he started. And
tough break.
Tough break. Well, I was looking.
This is like 12, 13 years old.
Yeah. I don't think Martha's Vineyard was quite as exclusive as it is now. I saw some photos. It just looked like, some surfboards on the beach. Who's surfing at Martha's Vineyard? I don't know. All right, but it's here that he meets another kid who would become a lifelong friend, a guy named Danny Korchmer, or Cooch for short. Very unfortunate nickname. I assume his other friend Vag left. So Cooch was a couple years older and knew how to play guitar. So he gave James some lessons, some pointers, and the two started playing music together. And even at 13, it was said that when James would break out into a song at a barbecue or a bonfire, everyone would stop talking and just listen to him sing. And James eventually does go to the Milton School, but he hates it. He wasn't into sports. He would basically stay in his room and practice guitar all day. But he said it wasn't really that hard. It never, quote, it never took any work for me to play the guitar from the moment I got it. It was just a release and an outlet. Somehow I felt as though if it had taken any kind of discipline and effort or will or strength of character for me to develop, it never would have happened. So remember, something's hard. It's probably not worth doing.
Yeah. Okay, good. So it's really been a joyride for him. Keep going.
All right. So it's 1962. James has sold his cello and he's washed enough dishes at a local restaurant to buy an electric guitar.
Wait, I don't think so. I think you maybe skipped. Maybe you mentioned it, but that he played cello as a kid. So he had a cello.
He did. He had a cello that his parents bought for him. In fact, they sent away to a cello maker in Philadelphia for some specialized version. So again,
the cello makers of Philadelphia of lore. Right. Yes. I was asking because isn't there a cello on this record, or is that just a double bass with a bow?
It's a double bass with a bow, but I thought the same thing my entire life until I read this book.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
So he and Cooch are mesmerized by the music at the time. So they're listening to Joan Baez, they're digging Ray Charles and Elvis, and they're practicing their music. They're scoring some small gigs around the cafes and coffee shops in Martha's Vineyard. But jumping back into school, James is miserable. He leaves the Milton School during his junior year and finishes the remaining parts of that semester back at Chapel Hill in North Carolina. So upon moving back to North Carolina, James starts playing with his older brother, Alex, who had put together a small R&B cover band. They were playing Ray Charles music, Sam Cooke, tunes to drunk college students, which is the way to go when you're in a cover band. So James is getting some chops there. He's getting some live chops and performing experience, and he heads back to start his senior year at Milton, but falls into a deep depression. And again, he comes back home to Chapel Hill. He tells a family friend that if he's forced to go back to Milton, he's going to kill himself. So they put him in a mental hospital for 9 months, back up in Boston. But on the bright side, it was the same hospital where Ray Charles had once gotten detoxed. So James gets his crazy papers that allowed him to avoid the draft, and then he straight up escapes that hospital by hiding in a Dodge van that was driven by a friend. Now, I'm certainly not saying that he faked his mental condition in order to dodge the draft. But if I was saying that, we'd probably want to fact check it.
Oh, I think you're throwing it to me, Adam, and I'm excited to jump in here, interrupting your story to introduce a brand new segment we're calling Fact Checking Phil. Now, Phil, now on our Doors episode a few weeks back, you made some wild and seemingly off the cuff statements, as you are wont to do.
Okay, that's story checks out.
I dare say making bold, unsubstantiated claims is a large part of your day-to-day life. Is that fair, Phil?
That's fair.
Now, I should mention to the listeners, this is a complete surprise to Phil. We've tried to spring it on him.
It's good. It's good. You're going to get the best reaction.
In this segment, I'm going to recount to Adam here things Phil said during the show recently, which are of, let's say, questionable provenance. Adam, your job will be to determine if Phil's extemporaneous declarations were factual or not.
All right. Now, remember, I was not on the Doors episode.
That's
correct.
And
I've not yet heard it either. It is still being edited. So, all right. This is good.
That is correct. That is correct. And in this case, as you mentioned, I have pulled several proclamations from our Doors episode, which happened just 2 weeks ago. So, Adam, are you ready?
Let's do this thing.
Cool. When we discussed the Doors debut album, there was a fair amount of drug talk, believe it or not. At one point in that episode, Phil mentioned that, quote, alcohol doesn't work while on LSD. Adam, do you think that is an accurate and factual statement?
Hang on. There is a world where scientifically that makes sense. However, I'm going to say no. I do not think that is accurate. I think alcohol does have an effect while on LSD.
That is correct. I've pulled a quote from the Addiction Centers of America. Alcohol consumption further increases the unpredictability of LSD, making this drug even more dangerous. They have a little bit of an agenda here. While alcohol can dull the hallucinogenic effects of LSD, it can also exacerbate other effects of the drug, and they report that some of the most critical mistakes users of LSD make is taking the drug after they've already been drinking or neglecting to let that drug take effect before adding alcohol into the mix. Phil, what do you have to say for yourself?
Well, I definitely, I think you're right to call me out here, right? These are some serious claims I've made, right? So I'm glad that you've straightened this out. Also, if I think it through, right, like at some point the alcohol is just going to kill you, right? LSD isn't the antidote, right? So
it's true.
This all makes sense.
We did discuss how much easier it would be to overdose on alcohol versus LSD, and Jim Morrison did test that theory.
Yes. This does sound like that as well.
Okay, next up, we have a couple more. Next up, this one's about a similar topic. When we discussed the young Jim Morrison participating in some early scientific trials of LSD, while it was still completely legal, and as he attended UCLA, you, Phil, threw out a wild claim that world-famous actor, Academy Award nominee, and paragon of the square community, Cary Grant, also delved into his own subconscious via LSD trials. Adam, is this slander or is it fact?
Wait, Cary Grant, as in the movie star?
That's correct. From North by Northwest.
North by Northwest, yes. I think that's true.
This from The Guardian. It is true, Adam.
Yes!
This from The Guardian. Cary Grant, at the height of his fame, not only experimented with LSD, but credits it with completely changing his life for the better.
Wow. Nice work, Bill.
Are you getting any of that on the mic, by the way?
Probably read a similar article.
I think I'm all right. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
He's estimated to have taken the drug about 100 times between 1958 and 1961. This is the same time he's starring in movies like North by Northwest.
Yeah, right.
And by the way, he was so jazzed about it, he wanted everyone to know about it. Apparently, that he had gone through some midlife crisis. He tried to unpack his mind with yoga, with meditation. He found them both wanting, and he ends up doing weekly sessions with a Beverly Hills psychiatrist who administered the drug.
Wow. That is wild.
That is wild. It's a wild story. Now, I should mention that he eventually rolled back his support for LSD after it became illegal, part of the counterculture. But this was seen as more of a Hollywood image problem than actually. He never regretted the experience, certainly.
Right.
Okay. And we have one last statement to fact check here. I saved the wildest and perhaps the most bizarre claim for last. There were lots of other options to choose from, by the way, on episode 169, The Doors, so please go listen to that if you haven't. But this one stuck out as being particularly madcap. Now, during the episode, when discussing various 60s musical luminaries and their paths to stardom and legend, Phil said that he, quote, would have really made it happen in the 60s. Adam, is that true?
Absolutely. Phil would have taken over the world in the 60s. He was born in the wrong decade. The world is worse off for Phil being born in 1980.
I wouldn't go that far.
No, sorry, that's terrible. That's bad. Never mind.
Surprisingly, it is true. Phil was clearly born in the wrong decade. I think Phil could have easily been a monstrously successful cult leader in 1966.
I agree with that fact. Or if nothing else, like a really hardcore like Peter to somebody else's Jesus. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I think let's upgrade you to Judas, Phil, please.
Okay. All right.
And that concludes our very first edition of the Fact Checking Phil segment. Phil, we look forward to more wild claims from you on any episode you take part in. Thank you for playing.
Excellent. All right, so James has just escaped a mental hospital. He calls his buddy Cooch, who was living in New York City at the time, and Cooch suggests that they start a band. So James heads down from Massachusetts to New York City. They decide to start a band called The Flying Machine, where James would be the lead singer. But Adam, where is he staying when he's in New York? Well, he found some pretty cheap rates at a hotel that had partially burnt down. And the best part, there was rehearsal space there in a rat-infested basement room where they were allowed to use it for loud music.
Awesome.
Perfect.
And it's here in the summer of 1966 in New York City that James gets addicted to heroin at only 18 years old, an addiction that would last 18 years.
So just so we're lining things up correctly, go to an Antarctic research station, get alcoholism. Go to a rat-infested tenement in New York City, get a heroin addiction.
Yes, that is accurate. So this new band, The Flying Machine, is gigging around New York City. A producer sees the band at a gig. They were playing sets in between the Turtles, who were doing a residency in some small club. The producer offers to help them cut a record. So they go into a studio in New York City. They're recording what they think are demos, but the producer, unbeknownst to the band, goes and cuts a single and releases it. Now, the band's pissed off. The single goes nowhere, but it spooks them enough that they go and find a manager to keep that from happening again and to help them get gigs. So they get a manager who lands them a gig at the grand opening of a grocery store in Union, New Jersey, and the band breaks up.
A grocery store is not a place where you should be listening to hip music. Let's be honest.
I'm just picturing how disappointed. I mean, we've all played shitty gigs.
Yeah.
Gigs where you've seen the name and then you roll up and in your head, you're like, what's this going to be like? And it is far below what you ever could have expected. I can't imagine.
And it's a coned off area in a grocery store parking lot.
With like a 6-inch stage of, whatever it is, wooden pallets or something.
Oof, that's a tough gig.
And just a quick fact here, because on our recent Jesus Christ Superstar episode, Rob had brought up band names from British bands in the 1960s. The one from that episode was the Blue Monks and the Dirty Habits. That's an awesome band name.
Great band.
Well, I've got potentially the worst band name I've ever heard. After Flying Machine breaks up, James's former bandmate Cooch joins a band called, wait for it, Lothar and the Hand People.
Whoa.
Yeah, just unbook your gigs,
Like what? I
Wait,
know
are
there was
you-
the S.
Yeah, I wondered if you were all thinking of the Mike Myers SNL sketch that had a theme song, which went, Lothar of the Hill People.
It has to be related.
It must.
It's just too similar.
Too good.
So,
It's too good.
yeah, it's too good. Now, during his time with the Flying Machine, James's heroin addiction is getting really bad. He said he just kind of fell into it at the time in Greenwich Village because scoring heroin was as easy as getting a drink or bumming a cigarette off of a stranger. And before he knew it,
I heard him say I listened to his Mark Maron WTF interview, and he mentioned that he had met a drummer, maybe someone who he felt he credited with introducing him to a lot of music and turning him on to Latin music and country music and all this stuff, but also heroin. So,
Yeah, yeah.
your
I forget the
friends
guy's
are
name, but-
typically really the culprits here.
right, right. Now, before he knows it, he has junkies, runaways, strippers, straight up criminals who are living in his apartment. And he eventually hits rock bottom and calls, of all people, his father. So
That's a
Ike
rich
picks
kid
up-
pro move, by the way.
That's the prodigal son move right there. JC Superstar callback, right?
Good call, yeah.
Yeah. So his father, Ike, picks up the phone. He knows something's wrong. First, because James called him. Secondly, James had labored breathing. He was having a hard time getting words out. And his father tells him, "Stay put. What's your address? I'll be right there." His father hangs up and immediately drives to the Raleigh-Durham airport and gets the next flight to New York. He lands, rents a station wagon at LaGuardia, drives to Greenwich Village, picks up James along with all of his music gear, and drives through the night back to Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Well, that's a good dad there. I made light of it, but to be clear, that would be a harrowing call to receive as a parent, and
Man.
yet that is the kind of the call you want to receive, as opposed to
Yeah,
letting
I mean,
that go by.
no, he
Yeah.
definitely more than answered the bell. So,
Yeah.
great work.
Yeah, James credits his dad with saving his life. And he said that if his father had just sent him a plane ticket, he most certainly would have just sold it and sold it to buy more smack. So James spends 6 months in recovery, which included a rehab and also a throat operation because apparently he was screaming too much in the flying machine. And he's now just turning 20.
Hold on a second.
And-
Do we want to pause on that detail for a second?
James Taylor screaming.
He was in
so
a grindcore band before this.
Screamo, yeah. Yeah, I can't wait to get my hand on those tapes. What was their name again?
Screamo,
Yeah. What was their name? Flying Lotus?
the flying machine. Yes,
Yeah.
a hardcore thrash metal band. Lots of blast beats all over.
Way ahead of their time.
This is tangential, but I don't think it's ever come up on this podcast, which I'm surprised about. But you know how Billy Joel was in that prog metal band called Attila before he became Billy Joel? And then he went out of his way
I've
to
definitely
like
seen the cover.
I remember
No, what?
a drummer. You can get it on YouTube because I think Billy Joel has gone out of his way to scrub any evidence of it from any streaming service. The band is called Attila, and the cover, the one I listened to, he's playing organ, not piano. It's super weird and proggy. He's not singing, I don't think. And the cover is like them in Viking outfits with like fur over them.
That's definitely the one I saw. Yes.
Oh, that is fantastic. All right. That'll be on the focus list next. No, I don't know. So
Next time Billy Joel comes up, we can definitely get some Attila in there just for fun.
Definitely.
So James is just now turning 20 years old. He decides he's got to get away. And he uses money that was left to him by his grandmother on his father's side. And he flies to England with dreams of making it big in London. He also bought a car while he was there. So
No biggie.
again,
Just-
he's doing okay.
Yeah. Immediately runs into the Beatles. I think that's the
Right,
next
exactly.
bullet point. I think it's going all right.
Don't spoil it. So he obviously had enough money for that inheritance. He was able to afford rent, bop around from one hippie enclave to the next. So James is doing his thing. He's solo gigging. He's busking around a bit, meeting a ton of new people. And among those new people was a woman named Jodie Steele, who was a set designer for the BBC and convinced him that he needed to go into the studio and record a demo. So he drops a whopping $8 and gets a 45-minute recording session.
That won't even these days. That won't even buy you the what that like record booth in Jack White's store that records on wax for 3 seconds or whatever.
So he gets that 45-minute recording session, lays down the demos of a handful of songs, including Something in the Way She Moves. Now, at this point, James is still in contact with his old buddy Cooch back in the US, who is an avid reader of Billboard and Cashbox, and he's keeping up with the goings on of the British music scene. And there's another connection here that's going to enable James's success. So Cooch's old band was called the King Bees, and they had once toured with a very successful British pop duo called Peter and Gordon. So Cooch tells James that Peter Asher, the Peter from Peter and Gordon, had recently become an A&R guy for the Beatles' new record label, Apple Records, and that they were looking for new talent.
Listen, first of all, this is the coolest time in history to be in London. This is swinging London.
Seriously.
And to have money to throw around and to be a young man, like
You're like, I sold some shipping companies. Would you like to? Would you like to hear my songs?
and then you have a in with the Beatles. Oh my God.
That's insane. So Cooch gives James Peter's phone number and they connect, and James gives his demo to Peter Asher, who's now the A&R guy. Asher is impressed with James's demo and even plays it for none other than Sir Paul McCartney. Not Sir at the time, sorry, Paul McCartney, who eagerly gave him the go-ahead to give James a recording contract. And that is a great spot for our favorite segment. This is James Taylor by the numbers. One, as in the first. As in the first artist that the Beatles signed to their label, Apple Records, was James Taylor. 3 million. Bit of a spoiler alert here, but this album, Sweet Baby James, was pretty damn successful. Has gone triple platinum over the years, but granted, that's over the course of 40 years.
To be clear, not the one he recorded with Apple. So the Beatles missed out on that.
Correct. Yes.
Because I don't know if you're going to get into it at all, Adam. I know it's ancillary to what we're talking about, but Apple Records was not well run. I think, like similar to how Led Zeppelin's foray into running a label went, they realized you can't be in a successful rock band and also run a label. It just doesn't work.
We'll hit on it because that is another pivotal moment. All right, the next number is 100 million, and that is the estimated total global album sales for all of James Taylor's 20 studio albums.
Damn.
10 million. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of albums. This dude is he's an icon. He's somebody that you kind of forget about, but my God.
No, I agree. I mean, he won the game, right? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of hits.
He does.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even as
And
an interpreter of songs too, like which we already alluded to with the You've Got a Friend, but even later, right? He did some interpret How Sweet It Is,
Yeah.
Oh,
did that
Susanna.
kind of thing. Well,
Oh, Susanna, that's a great one.
we'll call that a lesser track.
10 million. That is the sales of his greatest hits album, released in 1976. One of those I certainly bought. I contributed, or maybe it was my older sister going through Columbia House. And it was probably around 1990. But I remember at the time I had heard Your Smiling Face. And I was like, what is that song? It's so cool. There's this bass breakdown. And I ran to the greatest hits album and it wasn't on there. And I was crushed thinking like, what idiot put this thing together? And instead of that song, put on the live version of Steamroller Blues. Well,
Oh,
it
man.
turns out that my favorite song there, Your Smiling Face, wasn't released until 1977. And his greatest hits were released in 1976.
Boosh.
Bingo. All right. Next up is the number 6. That is the number of words that George Harrison unconsciously borrowed from James Taylor for his song Something. George Harrison had
At least they got something out of the deal.
George Harrison had heard James's demo, which included the song Something in the Way She Moves. 0 is our next number.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
Can we talk about James? We mentioned it on the Abbey Road episode that this was a direct lift and that they had been there listening to the demo for sure. And I heard James Taylor, it got brought up in the interview I listened to with Mark Maron, and he seems very chill about it now and said, I've borrowed tons of stuff from the Beatles as well. Totally fine. But what do you think that was like in the moment? That couldn't have felt great, right?
Not at all. Like the rage. Yeah. Like, can you imagine James Taylor getting angry? This may have been the one time when he I don't know.
Now, the saving grace would be that I guess his Something in the Way She Moves came out before Abbey Road came out. I'm guessing, right?
Yes, in fact, the Apple record, I think it was, but it was only by like 2 weeks. Well, no, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Something was not on the White Album. Something was on
Abbey
Abbey
Road.
Road.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, you're right. It came out probably a year, maybe
Yeah,
after
that sounds
James
right.
Taylor's. Yeah.
Okay. You can continue now.
All right. Our next number is the number 0. That is the number of days in jail that James spent for hitting a pedestrian while he was strung out on heroin.
Oof.
After a late night binge, James hit a dude with his car. The guy went flying 8 feet up in the air and landed on the ground. The cops, though, gave him a free pass because the dude he hit was actually running from the cops because he had punched one of their buddies in the face. This happened in London.
This is
Man.
insane.
That's
Right?
wild.
Back in the day, you could be like, it's okay. You're completely intoxicated, but just thanks for stopping the criminal that punched our
Wow.
fellow bobbies. All righty.
So he's back on the smack, though. He's back on the smack when he's in
Oh
London.
yeah, he's heavy into it when he's in London.
Okay.
All right, our next number, the number 4, that's the number of casts that he had at one point. After returning to the US from England in 1969, he was in Martha's Vineyard at the time. James borrowed a stolen motorcycle which had no brakes. He realized this fact once he hit 55 miles an hour. And when you don't have brakes, the next best thing are trees. So he crashed into the woods, breaking both hands and both feet.
Can you even imagine what that recovery period is like?
You know, I didn't even think about that. Oh my God. I'd rather have broken femurs. At least I could wipe my, anyway. Wow.
Oh my God. If you could just leave my pants off for the next 6, 7 weeks.
Sit in the bathtub with the water running slowly for
You
4
could
months.
you could come and just feed me grapes every 4 hours. Oh God.
All right. Our next number, 170. That's the number of songs that James Taylor has written in his career. And for our last number, we're going to hit 170 again. What are the chances? That is the number of episodes that we have in our back catalog here at 1001 Album Complaints.
Ooh.
And that's 170 opportunities for you to shake your head in agreement or throw your phone across the room in disgust at our takes on the albums that you love and hate. So I encourage you to go look through our prior episodes. There's something for everyone. And after you do that, I want you to go sign up for free on our Patreon page where you can keep the conversation going long after this episode airs. So head over to patreon.com/1001 album complaints, sign up, chime in, share your thoughts, and get the inside scoop on upcoming albums and show ideas. As always, that link is in the episode notes.
Comments are getting better and better every week over there. And we should say there's a bunch of bonus episodes. So actually, I think we're up over 200 at this point, if you count those in.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, we got a lot of good, and if I do say so, hilarious bonus content over there. All right, now when we last left James, Paul McCartney had just told the rest of the Beatles that they should sign James Taylor and fund his album. They agree, and they get to work. James and Peter Asher put ads in the weekly music publications NME and Melody Maker for backing musicians for the album. They hold auditions, and James puts together a band to record this debut album. So he writes a bunch more material, and they record at Trident Studios between July and October of 1968. And for these super Beatles nerds out there, you'll recognize that this time period was also when the Beatles were working on the White Album between Trident and EMI Studios. So,
I mean, that's like a super historic studio. That's where like Elton John records and Queen records were cut. That's like, you know, it's right up
Trident,
there
yeah.
the road. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's just hanging out there.
Just hanging out. So when
Cool.
James would come to record, the Beatles were leaving. Apparently they were in the same studio using the same gear.
I heard he jammed with them a little bit and was like listening to tracks from the White Album and stuff.
In the booth. Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. So now James lays down the main tracks for this first album. Then Peter Asher handed them off to an orchestral arranger named Richard Hewson. Now, this rubbed James the wrong way because as the record progressed, he was hearing versions where Houston, the arranger, was getting a bit too complicated for these otherwise simple songs. Houston added string sections, harpsichords all over the album. In fact, there's a 40-second harpsichord intro for Something in the Way She Moves.
Hmm.
Let me try to bring that up.
Pro move.
A little Beatlesque in a bad way.
Yeah, right. Oh. That goes on for 30 seconds.
Get.
Then he goes into the song.
There's something in the
Did you think they directed him to sing in the Kermit the Frog voice? Is that like a production tip?
Can we back it up one bullet point and wildly speculate that? Do we know who introduced John Lennon to heroin? Maybe it was James Taylor.
I was wondering if maybe in addition to sharing studios, they were sharing dealers. You know,
that would certainly have brought him into the inner circle.
Ingratiate yourself with Yoko and John. There it is. Now, this album also has a version of Carolina in My Mind. Hang on. Now, this album that he recorded also has a version of Carolina in My Mind, which is way different than the version that we all know. This one has a McCartney bass line, a bunch of backing vocals by George Harrison and Peter Asher, and an odd string section that comes in that we'll play here. Let's see if I can do this again. Hang on.
In my mind, I'm going to Carolina. Can you see the sunshine? Can you just feel the moonshine?
I have several comments. I have several comments. So first of all, that's just piggies, right? It sounds like piggies. Right?
I put my finger on it.
But am I also to believe that that's Paul McCartney playing bass? Like he's got the Beatles laying down tracks with him?
Yeah.
Hold on. There's so many things to unpack here. Yeah, one, the piggies connection, which is like, oh, George Harrison. The narrative has become George Harrison. Oh, he's writing all these songs, but he's so underfoot of John and Paul. How dare they? But now we just know he's ripping everything off of James Taylor. Now, I'm sure next week you're going to have a fact-checking Rob segment. Second, though, is you tried a song with the Beatles playing on it. Paul McCartney on bass, Harrison on background vocals, helping with the production. And you're like, nope, I think I can do it better. And you were right. Like, what are the chances of that?
Oh,
Yeah, it's a great point.
Gangster move. So the long and short of it is that this debut album is way overproduced. James didn't like it. He thought that Asher and Houston were taking over and basically making it a Beatles album. And at the same time, James started doing even more heroin.
As one does when the producer's Sgt. Pepper all over your album.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
It's a good verb. So when you wonder, well, why isn't his debut album chosen for the 1001 list? It's because it doesn't really represent James Taylor. Now, I actually like that album. I went and I listened to it. And honestly, I think it's more interesting. I think the songs are more interesting. They go places. I understand that this orchestral aspect kind of took over. But if I was comparing the two as to which would keep me more interested, man, that debut has it. All right, so the Apple album is finished, but shortly after they wrap up mixing, James learns of the suicide of a close friend back in New York named Susan Schnare. Now, she had died 6 months prior, but his friends in England who knew kept the news from him because they wanted him to be able to focus and concentrate on his debut album. So James was really beat up when he learned about her death, and 10 days later, he had written the outline for what would become Fire and Rain, which is on our focus list.
So you must mean her name is Suzanne, right?
It's Susan. Hang on. Let me double check that. Come on.
I've definitely heard that story before, and that's really shitty. That's got to put you in a weird spot, both, personally and with your friends who didn't tell you. about Suzanne's death.
Yeah, that's rough. In an attempt to protect you, I suppose. And
Yeah,
Rob, you're
sure.
right. It's Suzanne. So I'm gonna give myself a clean Suzanne Schneer. All right.
I only know because the song says her name that way.
I thought maybe he was like, I don't want people to know, so I'll make it Susan. Anyway.
But she's dead.
All right. She probably doesn't care. So his debut album was released by Apple in the UK on December 6th, 1968, just a couple weeks after the Beatles had released the White Album. Now, the album didn't do very well, partly because James was back in the US and he was recovering from his heroin addiction, so he wasn't actually able to promote the album. So now James is back in the USA, and after healing from his motorcycle crash that I mentioned earlier, he's approached by Peter Asher. Now, Peter was looking to leave Apple Records because, if you recall from the Let It Be episode, like Rob was saying, they hired this guy named Alan Klein to manage the band. And a lot of folks didn't like the way that he was running it, and a bunch of people started jumping ship from Apple. And Peter Asher was one of those people. So Asher and
Hold on. Serious question. When he's sitting there with both wrists broken and both feet broken, is he able to do heroin?
good question.
Does he
Wait,
hire
I'm
a guy
also
for
wondering-
that?
Wait, didn't Bonnie Raitt have some similar thing where she was some terrible alcoholic and then she got in some like skiing accident? She was laid up for
Oh,
like 2 months
she-
and she kicked the booze.
She was supposed to work with Prince, and she had a skiing accident, and they just never got back together. He wanted to basically write an album with her. But yeah, you're right.
Okay. But she didn't. She wasn't like a bad alcoholic and got clean like the skiing accident.
No, if I recall the timing, I think she had gotten cleaned, or maybe that was her excuse to clean up. I should go back and.
But I don't think it's JT's because I heard him say that he had been sober for about 30 years on this 2015 podcast, I feel like. So I think he's still got more heroin in his future at this point.
Yeah, 18 years worth, starting at 18. So terrible.
He's only like 24, 25 now.
Yeah. So Peter Asher and James are looking to get away from Apple. They call up Paul McCartney and ask him to tear up James's Apple contract. Now, Alan Klein wanted James or another record company to buy out the rest of the contract, but Paul McCartney, being the ultimate cool guy, says, quote, "Look, man, we're artists here. This is the idea of Apple. We should let him go. He's given us a great album. He's made us money. Why do we need to keep him like a slave?" So McCartney tears up.
Wow.
It's an old interview.
A rare poor maneuver by McCartney, though. I mean, I kind of always assumed he was a savvy businessman. He didn't go with Alan Klein, for instance, but
You're right.
this was yeah, a little weird.
So McCartney tears up that contract. James leaves Apple, and Peter Asher becomes his manager. Now, Asher lines up a deal in the summer of 1969 with Warner Brothers to have James start recording a new album in December of that same year. Asher said they really wanted to be on the Warner Brothers album label because that's where all of their favorite contemporaries were recording. People like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Randy Newman, who was called out by name. God, I love Randy Newman. And I should have had that episode number ready. We do have a Randy Newman episode if you want to go back and look, folks. So with both
It's
his hands,
73, Adam.
go check out our episode 73 on Randy Newman, a fantastic episode, if I do say so. And with both his hands and feet now healed, he was raring to go. And that brings us to today's album, Sweet Baby James. We're here. Now, Warner Brothers gives them $20,000 to start the album and promise him an additional $20,000 after the album is finished. So, of the $40,000 in play, they only spend about $7,600 on personnel and studio time. That's the way to do it.
Let me guess where the other money went.
That's the way to do it. Now, Asher is pretty well plugged into the scene, so he starts assembling a band. Most notably, he had been a fan of Carole King from a distance for quite some time, as she was writing songs for acts like the Drifters. Now, he had heard her piano playing from some of her demos, and he really liked the way she played. Now, Carole King had moved to Los Angeles in 1968 after making quite a name for herself at the Brill Building back in New York City as a songwriter. So Asher approaches her, asks her if she wants to play piano on an album for an unknown up-and-coming folk singer. She agreed to meet James. They got along musically, they got along personally, and it was a done deal. So the band they assembled was Cooch on guitar, Russ Kunkel on drums, Carole King on piano. I know Cooch. And of
Kunkel,
course,
Cooch, and King in one band.
It's the dream team.
and of course James Taylor on guitar, right?
It is crazy because Carole King's Tapestry would only come out a year later or something, right?
Yeah,
and be this huge
right.
seller, and now she's this household name.
So in prep for these recording sessions, the core band would rehearse at Peter Asher's house in Los Angeles for 5 hours a day. And they didn't have a steady bass player for the album, but that small group would play on every song with some different bass players peppered in throughout the album, including Randy Meisner from Poco. Fun story with Poco. God, I love Poco too. Timothy B. Schmidt would take over on bass from Randy Meisner when Meisner left Poco. Now, Randy moved on to the Eagles. Randy left the Eagles, and Timothy B. Schmidt again moved over to take his place in the Eagles. That is just great.
It's classic. Meisner's out. Get me Schmidt.
So the album Sweet Baby James was recorded over about 2 weeks in Sunset Sound Studios in Los Angeles. And one final note on the album is that they ran out of material. And no big surprise, but
Okay.
I'm just guessing, here's some speculation from me, that their contract probably said they had to deliver at least 30 minutes of material to satisfy that Warner Brother contract.
You meant songs. I thought you meant drugs and money.
Now, James admits, he said, I had a lot of fragments of other various songs, so I strung them together, and we named it after the balance of record company cash waiting for us. That's the last song on the album, called Sweet for 20G. And while that song is not on our focus list, I think it's pretty obvious that that one was just kind of thrown together. It's a bit of a mess.
Seems like he had plenty of time to prepare the material and know approximately how long it would be and things like that, right?
Well, and here's the question. If his hands and feet are broken, is he just like telling people to write his lyrics down? Like A minor. All right. And then I do this. All right. Go to a G, mate. Like,
He's got
how's
a
he
pen
doing?
in his mouth. Yeah. Right.
He's like, it's a D, then a D sus, then a D, then a D sus, then another D sus, then we'll go to an A sus, then an A, then an A sus, then a D sus.
All right. And since this is the only album from James Taylor on the list of the 1001 albums, I just want to quickly round out this man's life. So he achieved major success with his next album called Mudslide Slim and the Blue Horizon, which had his version of Carole King's You've Got a Friend.
Great tune. Very well written song. Is this one of the ones, when does he put on that mustache? Because that was ill-conceived. I'm going to blame heroin on that one.
I don't know. I don't have his mustache.
Is that the, because I do have a record album of his. It's not the one we're looking at, but it has him on like a raft with a paddle. He looks like a swamp person.
Is there a Randy Newman cover of You've Got a Friend in Me on the Toy Story soundtrack?
No, it's a different tune.
So you're sure? Okay. That's another song. Okay, so that is a different song.
Yes.
The outro song.
Different song with a similar title and hook.
Right. All right, next up, he marries Carly Simon in 1972, a high-profile marriage that produced 2 children, Ben and Sally, both of whom become musicians. Couple divorced in 1983. He marries actress Catherine Walker in 1985. That marriage lasted about a decade. Then he married Kim Smedvig in 2001, and when he wasn't busy getting married, he managed to put out 18 more studio albums after Sweet Baby James. And that brings us...
Workhorse.
Yeah.
That's a lot. It's a lot. All right, gents, what do you say we dive into some of these songs?
Yes.
Let's do it.